Okay, part 2 of Tissue. And remember, with Tissue, it's a double meaning poem. Tissue is both the paper tissue, but also the human tissue. And it's that interaction between humanity and between the paper that sometimes controls us that Imtiaz Dharka is exploring. We're looking now at the next 3 stanzas. We've looked at the first 3 already in part 1, and we're starting from line 13. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps 2. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. Okay, some interesting images here, and remember, we're looking for those images that you can dig deep with, that you can squeeze so much out of, and be able to write a lot about a short quote when it comes to the exam. So let's start with the first bit. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Let's take that all as one. If we were going to take a quote for it, I might feel their drift. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. So Dharka is imagining that buildings that hold all of that power could be made of paper. And as such, we've talked about how paper is transparent. So if you imagine, say, a government building or a palace or something where power is held, where decisions are made. If it was paper, the sun would shine through. Remember, the sun is all about hope. It's light shining through, but also think of that transparency, how we would be able to see through into the decision-making process, how we as people would be a party, would be included in that power struggle, in that decision-making process that somehow evades us and we're missed out from. So buildings being made of paper would allow us to do that. But also I might feel their drift. Let's think about what a drift means. It means it's movement. It's a metaphor for movement. So the paper buildings would easily move. But also, a drift means purpose. I catch your drift, we sometimes say. Drift means the purpose of something, a political movement perhaps. So it means that instead of being stuck in a particular method of power, that if buildings were paper, that power could easily shift to someone else. So it would be easily changeable, maybe back to the people, maybe another governing body or whatever, but power would then shift more easily. So we've got a couple of meanings there. But also think about these verbs and the words to do with sigh, shift, direction of the wind. Notice the adverb easily. So if buildings were paper, we wouldn't have a struggle to change power. It would happen more straightforwardly. It would happen more quickly. We would feel more in control, or at least that control wasn't permanent, that it would quickly change. And so the emphasis here is on how they're changeable. We talk about the winds of change and how political systems can easily change. There's a song by the Scorpions called The Wind of Change, which is about the end of communism. So we're talking about big political shifts. And actually, Imtiaz Dharka is suggesting that that could happen much more easily if buildings were made of paper. Let's look at the next stanza, Maps 2. So notice that caesura there, Maps 2. She's thinking, we talked in the first part about how this poem is both impressionistic but also a reflective monologue. She's thinking, and that thought takes her to Maps 2, and then she starts to think about how maps represent power. And again, I mentioned briefly that maps themselves don't necessarily have the power, but they reflect how nations are formed and how we are made separate as people rather than brought together. And by holding the power, you are holding power within that state. And so maps are a reflection of the power that are held within states. So she's thinking about that. The sun shines through their borderline. So although the borderlines are fixed and are an essence of power shown through the maps, the sun shines through. They can change. There's optimism. There's always that positivity coming through, according to Dharka. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, And then we move straight on to fine slips from grocery shops. Notice that listing there. It's an easily overlooked poetic structure, a list. And the same if you're looking at your non-fiction or in your novels, whatever. Dickens, for instance, uses a lot of listing. Listing is a great way for writers to put across ideas quickly and for different purposes. So don't overlook listing as a language technique. And in this case, the listing here is emphasizing how man-made these borderlines are. Now we've got the roads, the rail tracks, very much man-made. All the borderlines are man-made. She also includes the rivers and the mountain folds, and you might be thinking here, well, that's not man-made. No, it's not, but the borderlines that are made by those rivers and mountain folds are man-made. It's like we're taking control of nature to divide rather than bring together. So a river that might mark the division between two nations doesn't have to mark the division between two nations. It's a natural feature, and it's men, it's humankind who've put that division along that natural feature. So think about how the borders are man-made, not necessarily those natural features. And she's listing all the ways we use maps, we use borderlines to divide people rather than bringing people together. Then, the final stanza for this bit, the fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. Now, this is all about how we use money every day. And even when we're not using money to pay for things, and at the moment, of course, we're using a lot of credit cards and payments by phone, payments by internet. So not all of it is physical money, but it's the power that money has. So even when we spend via credit card or debit card by chip and pin, we get a paper-based account of how much we've paid. So they are the fine slips. Even when we're paying for groceries, we are controlled by money. And money is an artificial, man-made way of using paper as power. Okay? Now, what she's talking about there is the juxtaposition between everyday items, the fine slips from grocery shops, these are the receipts we're talking about, and credit card receipts. We'll talk about that, but also a wider sort of system of socio-economic control, keeping the rich richer, keeping the poor poorer. And actually, money does have that power. But what Darker is saying really is that it's the paper-based system of power that could easily shift if things really were made of paper. Power can shift, poverty can shift, money can shift, and she's trying to put an optimistic spin on that. Now, the most interesting image within there, I think, is the key quote from this session: might fly our lives like paper kites. Let's look at this. Firstly, she's suggesting that money controls our lives. So we are being controlled. It flies our lives like we're the paper kite. So we are just drifting on the wind. We are being controlled by something else, being controlled by the money, by the paper that symbolises that wealth. But also, there's deeper meanings within this. Firstly, might fly our lives like paper kites. We go back to our childhood and we think of kites and the innocence and the peace that we had. And Darker's trying to suggest that we should maintain that innocence, that inner peace, that childlike wonder where things were much more simple. She wants life to be simpler. Finally, the simile suggests that control is easy. Fly our lives like paper kites. It sounds like quite an easy method of control. We can all fly a kite fairly straightforwardly, but it's also fragile. Things can change. And always think about this poem as having more than one meaning. And the paper that controls us is also easily changed, as symbolised in that simile there.